This is part one of our Arguments for God series. In this video, we're going to discuss the ontological argument. And the ontological argument is, by Chris Langan's estimation, the most powerful and general argument for God. And the reason for this is that other arguments touch on some secondary trait of God. You know, there's all this cardinality in creation, and you need an identity such that everything can be contingent on that. That's the contingency argument of Leibniz. You have to have a first cause, so God is really just setting into motion the naturalistic events of the universe, and things seem to be evolving according to an intrinsic end and purpose. And we can find God in all of these ways, and there's very useful and logically rigorous ways we can go about doing this, but we're not touching at the fundamental being of God. You know, they say where there's smoke, there's fire, but what that's all leading to is back to this ontological argument, back to ontology, the study of being. As Thomas Aquinas says, God is ipsum esse subsistens, the sheer act of being itself. And so the question is, why is reality not has any particular characteristic, but why is reality not uninstantiated, patternless nothingness, barring a unique ontology which creates the reality it describes in the course of its self-identification, thereby coupling its essence, its mental conception, with its existence such that it can subsist in its own being. And only a maximally great being, i.e. provides the very standard for greatness such that it self-attributes goodness to its own structure and can exist and evolve in that way, could bring into being its own existence and evolution according to its self-attributed utility. So how is it providing this utility function at the global level, which is required for the things we see in reality? Because we see particular things. You can get out of this by saying there's a multiverse, but that's kind of an absurd, it's almost like a cop-out. Why are there particular things we see in creation, and there has to be a conscious chooser behind that that is setting these utility functions, and the maximal utility function must be God's own being. People think, teleology or goodness and morality are something which either hover above God in some determining way or are in an arbitrary decision of God, and it turns out it's actually neither. It is the very ground of God's being. Because, so then you can get from God, and you can get from that what would be the maximally great being, because something like this must exist. If there's even the mental conception of it, that this is what Anselm proved back in the 13th century, is that even the mental conception of a maximally great being implies its instantiation in reality. It begs its own existence, because such a being is the only thing with the right to exist in some fundamental sense. Because what else could bring itself into being? Why, in relativity, for example, we have this 4D kind of arbitrary and deterministic manifold with no real purpose behind its structure and evolution, and it's like, why does that exist as opposed to something else? Why? And God, and the conception of God is kind of overflowing into creation with its creative energy, etc. And there's this generative aspect to creation whereby God is getting some sort of utility, so is able to establish his identity in a more thorough and complete way using the created world. This is the kind of concept which can bring itself into being. There's an intrinsic utility in, prior to any instantiation, reality exists as potentiality. So why does that potential then become one particular actualization? It has to do that according to the structure of something akin to God. Chris Langan calls this a self-processing, self-configuring language. And it's a language because, language is a formal structure which makes some sort of attribution and identification and has this syntax, has this underwhelming structure. And even though reality is in some respects material and concrete, it's also, this language is also describing itself. It has this sort of self-awareness through the cognitive and perceptual syntax, at the very least, of human observers, and then it generalizes that to every little point in reality. And in order to have that identity, have a coherent and stable reality, it needs to have a few properties. It needs to be omnipotent, and any definition of God which doesn't include omnipotence would fall short of God, because God has to have this ultimate creative power. And it has to be omniscient, it has to be able to read to every point, because where we've actually defined being essentially as self-knowledge, that the sheer act of being itself is an act, and that act is one of self-identification. It's the intrinsic striving towards the goal of knowing itself and establishing a generative and dynamic identity at these various levels of being. It has to be omnipresent because it has to use every node towards its self-knowledge and self-power, and it has to be omnibenevolent because it's establishing the very utility of anything in reality. The fundamental utility or fundamental moral imperative is to aid in this self-identification. And so a maximally great being, what do we think of it? It's omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent. It is the very standard for goodness, and it has the power to enforce this. This is what Kant realized, is that moral justice Kant wasn't convinced by ontological or teleological arguments, but he realized that moral justice requires an ultimate moral judge. And Leibniz figured out that no two perfections are incompatible. A perfection is defined as an absolute and positive quality. And you can have a being which unites all of these into a fundamental structure of existence, and then embedded in that is a value structure. So the creator and king of the universe, because people also must realize that this must be a personal identity. It includes creation, but it also extends beyond creation because it has this identity that's established for itself through this potentialization which can't take place in the physical universe. So it extends beyond, not physically, but logically. There's this deep structure underlying its terminal instantiation. You can think of the universe as maybe the body of God, that God has to have this sort of embodied extensional existence, but there's also this intentional reality whereby God, you think, what is our fundamental experience of reality? Because we don't experience reality in an objective or material or mechanistic way. We experience it through human consciousness. So where that's our fundamental experience of reality, and the highest thing we encounter in life is always our relationship to other people, and it follows that the image of the infinite shouldn't be a material or an idea or force, etc. It has to be a person. And also, in order to have, we're attributing various things to God. We're attributing will, cognition, intrinsic goals, etc. And this requires a kind of generalized human cognitive perceptual syntax. Just as we are made in the image of God, God is, in a limited sense, in the image of us. He has to have the same kind of generic structure. And not in the sense that he's limited in this way, he's infinite, but that infinity is through this relationship with his creation. God is a creator. His fundamental imperative is to create, and his highest creation is always sentient beings. Sentient beings are the very building block of the universe. This is what we've talked about with respect to the participatory anthropic principle of John Wheeler, is that reality is parameterized according to the secondary utilities of its inhabitants, and where God identifies with that structure, he essentially has to be personal. So the sheer act of being itself is the creator and king of the universe as a personal being identified with the entirety of existence. Any definition of God not including the whole of reality as a personal and sovereign entity would fall short in most strands of monotheism for want of absolute creative power, knowledge, and presence. So the linguistic essence of reality, that SCSPL, which instantiates itself by spatial extension and teleological evolution, must be omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and personal. Not only it gives orderly harmony to the universe, this kind of idea of Spinoza's God, which is just these natural processes which make reality intelligible to itself, but also Langen talks about this, is that God can, all the traditional properties that we ascribe to God, God can hear prayer, can communicate with humans in the language that they know, and has a plan for our lives. And so you can also think about this in terms of syntactic unisect, is that if you have a relationship between any things in reality, there has to be a fundamental medium which contains and embeds both of the characteristics of those into this kind of more general rules and structure. And so if you think about what God's essential role is, God is the principle of consistency which binds all of the diversity in the cosmos. So what is it about God that can relate everything? And so God, anything which is an instantiation, a property realized in that medium, intelligence, creativity, consciousness, this teleology, this intrinsic striving towards a goal and a series of directed aims, seeking to fulfill themselves, this has to be embedded in God's global structure as well, where that's also embedded at the agentive level of utility. And this argument applies to the modal ontological argument as well, because the modal ontological argument essentially says, if it's possible that God exists, then God must exist, because God, where you define God as a necessary being, and where there's no logical contradiction here, because God is the very ground of logic and truth and being. We can go over this. It's clear that this would apply here as well, and thus the atheist would have to make the positive claim that it is not possible for God to exist. And God would turn around and laugh at them and say, it's not possible that you exist, but I fucking did that. I'm the creator and king of this universe. So God is a person, God is not an idea or force, and this is proven by kind of an advanced explication of the structure of the ontological argument. It's the most powerful and general argument for God, because ex nihilo nihil fit. Out of nothing comes nothing. You need God, you need this fundamental ontology to attribute existence to itself and allow for the structure of reality to even make sense at all. So, thank you. Let the light shine forth in darkness. May the peace of our Father in heaven be upon you. Like and subscribe. Peace.